Immortal Self-Esteem by Stuart Brooke Richardson. Narrated by the author. This book is dedicated to all those who are as yet unaware of their true stature. Introduction. This is a book that addresses the problem of self-esteem, not only in Western culture but also in the world at large. But because self-esteem is connected to our emotional core in general, and because many emotions are directly related to each other, I decided to include additional information in this book that is pertinent to the entire emotional spectrum. Another reason I thought it prudent to do so is because humans are emotional creatures, broadly speaking, and it is a rare person indeed who has full and complete mastery of his or her emotions. Negative and positive emotions, although it's the negative emotions that will be the primary focus of this book. I also think that when someone works to reduce one negative emotion, the other negative emotions are positively affected because of their connection within the emotional core. This means that the information in this book can be used for the reduction of any negative emotion, not just those directly involved with self-esteem. When you go to any library or bookstore, it's easy to see that the self-help section isn't lacking, at least not in terms of the sheer volume of content. But what is lacking are works that delve down into the heart of the matter, into the most profound depths of human knowledge and wisdom. Most books on the subject go into great detail about psychology, which is all well and good as this is obviously a critical factor in self-development. But discussing psychology without discussing its source is like discussing babies without discussing maternity. Or perhaps more to the point, it's like cleaning the windshield of a car that has 4 flat tires. Those who know me know that I'm not just an author. I'm also an electronic technician and systems analyst. In both of these adjacent fields, one of the constant necessities is finding the source of a particular problem, whatever that problem might be. Without going to the source, the problem itself will never be fixed, at least not properly. If an electronic technician replaces a blown transistor, that brand new transistor will blow out again within days if the cause of its being blown in the first place was poor heat dissipation. And systems analysts know that this is a common theme in so many areas of life. When something isn't functioning at the optimum level, you must always go to the source of the problem to find out why. In this book, I'll be importing this mantra of systems analysts worldwide into the realm of self-help and self-development, as I believe this is the only direct path toward attaining the state of mind that so many people in this world are seeking. And because I'm driving toward the ultimate source, some groundwork needs to be laid out first so the source can be logically ascertained and elucidated. So the first 2 chapters will deal with this groundwork, after which the main thrust of the narrative can begin to unfold. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised at the end results, and by that time, you will see why I have titled this book Immortal Self-Esteem. Part 1. The Visible You. Chapter 1. Materialism. When the average person looks in the mirror, they think that the reflection they're seeing is a representation of all that they are, apart from their thoughts and emotions. And as they go about their lives, they carry this mindset over into everything they do with the idea that others see them in exactly the same way. This is natural, as it's what we've all been taught since we were little. Kindergarten brought the first real lessons of identity, self, and society, even if society was only seen as the people in that one little class. Soon after, we were introduced to science and the scientific method, with its implied and overarching assumptions that 1. Anything invisible or previously unknown has to be proven, and 2. Proof can only be obtained through material evidence and consensus. And as these ideas were drilled over and over into our little heads, both directly and indirectly, by teachers and by society at large, They eventually became part and parcel of who nearly all of us would come to be: materialists. This outcome works out well for those individuals who go on to become scientists, politicians, construction workers, clothing designers, or teachers themselves. In fact, most adult specialties feature materialism at their core, not only because the paradigm of our society is itself based upon materialism, but also because human interactions are governed by materialistic thinking. And because this feature is paradigmatic, it means that materialism features in nearly every aspect of our lives, from education to industry, politics, entertainment, and almost any other area you can think of. One of the key outcomes of materialism is resource-based living, because after all, it is resources that produce materials, and materialists are nothing without their materials. Materials for houses, cars, clothing, smartphones, TVs, etc. are pivotal elements in the industrial realm, and are fought over tooth and nail due to their high perceived value. It is this fighting for resources that makes materialism the progenitor of competition. To the materialist, whoever has the most resources is the king or queen of the realm. And this materialistic competition breeds flamboyance, first by the winners, who feel they must show off their superiority, but then by the losers, who don't want to be seen as losers, so they dress themselves as winners. I use the term losers here because that is what is implied by the condescending actions and mannerisms of the winners. And flamboyance in turn breeds conspicuous consumption, aka consumerism. Again, because nobody wants to be seen as a loser, at least not anyone who lives and breathes for the modern paradigm, which is most people, of course. Public image. All this boils down to public image, which is one of the pivotal aspects of materialism. The reason it's so pivotal is because it's the element that causes so much of the psychological suffering in Western society and in the world at large. Because nobody wants to be seen as a loser, the average person engages in conspicuous consumption in the attempt to improve their image within society, usually local society, but this local activity supports the larger paradigm via broad connectivity and rapid proliferation. Conspicuous consumption has a tendency to provide people with at least a partial satisfaction about their public image, which causes them, typically, to transfer that partial public image satisfaction to their own internal self-image. And this materialistic support that humans employ, provided by new things, to prop up both their public and self-image, is always and forever only a partial fix. Let us now delve into some of the more specific aspects of public image. Beauty. Physical. Some people are born to have the perfect body, the excellently chiseled jaw, the smoothest complexion, the fullest hair, etc. Far fewer are born with a wide array of such physically attractive features. The ones who possess the greatest number of these beautiful traits are often placed on metaphorical pedestals by society in general, and are virtually worshipped for their mesmerizing appearance. However, the vast majority of people don't fall into either of these two categories, and the difference between the few and the many, in this case, is an important factor in our present study. The reason for this isn't hard to see. Those who were not born to be beautiful still have the desire to be beautiful. And depending upon their resources, these less fortunate people can often take steps in the attempt to become more beautiful if they choose. Those steps are usually not that meaningful, but nevertheless represent many huge industries: clothing, makeup, cosmetic surgery, etc. The staggering array of products and services in this arena, and the amount of money that these products and services collectively represent, is a testament to the importance that our society has placed upon them. One of the most important factors of physical beauty is transience. Physical beauty is never permanent. talent and skill. A truly talented person who also spends years honing his or her skills at whatever it is that they were born to be good at can also be a wonder to behold. These talented and skilled people who are also fortunate enough to possess physical beauty or handsomeness fall easily into the limelight. These are the singers, actors, and other entertainers. Those who don't possess that magical addition of physical attraction can still make quite a mark on society, as is the case with people like Bill Gates or Steve Jobs, or true brainiacs like Einstein and Stephen Hawking. Social acumen. Those who mingle easily, aren't afraid of attention, and have a good memory for names, faces, and anecdotes fit well into another socially desirable category. These are the ones with the gift of gab, and their power can be quite substantial. And whereas names like Oprah Winfrey and Conan O'Brien might spring to mind, another subcategory of this larger group contains people with even more power. These are the politicians, presidents and prime ministers, members of Congress, etc. It's no mystery that so many of the people who fit into these three categories, those with beauty, talent, skill, and social acuity, are either comfortable or extremely wealthy, as those attributes tend to make it easier for them to be rewarded in a pecuniary fashion. The converse is also the case. Wealthy people have more opportunities in society, so those who make it into a life of opulence have a tendency to stay either in or near the center of attention. And let's not forget that money is the ultimate resource, as it can purchase not only basic resources like food, water, and shelter, but virtually any other resource, with very few exceptions. It can also enhance one's public image with the purchase of some or all of the aforementioned tools of beautification. It can purchase higher education for the expansion of one's skill sets. And it can purchase, indirectly, at least limited access into the circles of fame, power, etc. In consequence, the acquisition of money is the ambition of almost every person on the planet, for one reason or another. One person might use it for comfort, another for fame, and yet another to help his ailing mother. There is literally no end to the uses of money in this modern age of anything goes. Everyone knows this at the gut level, and we have been deeply programmed as a culture, whether intentionally or unintentionally, to accept it without even questioning the pros and cons of the modern paradigm. The lottery. This is also why so many people dream about and play the lottery, because winning the lotto is a way for the average person to buy what they want, except for true happiness. More on this later. But the lottery is much like all these other categories. The winning ticket comes only to the very few and far between, the less than 1%. Winning at this level is not for the masses, as there's not that much money in the world to go around. So people play and play and play so that they themselves can be that one in a million who have the opportunity to find the needle in a haystack. And dollar by dollar, the vast majority of players slowly push themselves in the opposite direction from what they originally intended. In this case, losing has a pecuniary cost, which is what pays for that one winner. The media. The media consists of TV, movies, music, internet entertainment, and more. These varied but similar outlets continuously broadcast the central elements of the current paradigm, showcasing the beautiful, the rich, the talented, the social butterflies, and the winners. Sometimes they'll showcase a loser, mostly in film and TV, and in this case, the focus will generally be on the epic battle that person is fighting, so they can gain entry into one or more of these aforementioned categories, usually with the acquisition of money. The media is ever present, always available, always fresh and new, and usually in your face, as in the advertising facet. The owners of these outlets have the money and the gall to push their product, until it's seen by as many people as possible. And even then, they'll push some more. And what these outlets are pushing on you, ad nauseum, is not reality, but a meticulously crafted illusion that they themselves are creating in their attempts to fashion a new reality. But the new reality that is being fashioned is very seldom something that would be good for humanity. Vanity, greed, crime, corruption, horror, and selfish behavior generally rule the day in the media at large. And if all this was to actually become reality, society would be in for some very tough times indeed. But it has become a partial reality, which itself is the cause of a variety of problems. I'll elaborate on one of these problems shortly. The advertising arm of the media is perhaps the most insidious, as its purveyors, product makers, and the marketing firms that help them push their wares are constantly working at manipulating the subconscious minds of the public in any way that will raise the profits via increased sales volume. To do this, these ingenious people, the marketers, play on the insecurities of the modern psyche, pretending that their product is needed rather than just desired, or desired rather than just sitting there doing nothing. This type of highly conscious manipulation of the public psyche, which is both deceptive and duplicitous, was talked about in shocking detail by the inventor of modern marketing himself, Edward Bernays, back in the 1920s. Bernays' books, Crystallizing Public Opinion, 1923, and Propaganda, 1928, show just how callous his treatment of the public mind really was, and still is by the industry's modern proponents. In a press release at the time titled "Toxic Sludge is Good for You" by Common Courage Press, Bernays was quoted as saying, "If we understand the mechanisms and motives of the group mind, it is now possible to control and regiment the masses according to our will without their knowing it." He called this engineering consent. As appalling as it may sound, Bernays' books are today on the shelves of some of the most powerful people in the world. His methodologies are taught far and wide as the de facto standard in both marketing and public relations. He is widely known as the father of marketing, and the world of marketing manipulation today is, in large part, a product of his own making. The setup. This rather rare bird's-eye view of modern life represents what I call the setup. And although I have purposefully made this image of our times unusually bleak by leaving out the good stuff, I did this for a very important reason. I wanted to provide a single chapter framework concerning society in general, which focuses exclusively on the negative factors in our midst, which, together, act as a prime mover of sorts. This prime mover, as we shall see, plays a pivotal role in the self-esteem problem that is so prevalent in our modern society. And now that this grim version of our culture at large has been laid out for the reader, let us move on to the next piece of the puzzle. Chapter 2. Psychology. Chapter 1 provided a rough sketch of our current social and cultural framework, which is the structure around which the larger architecture of modern life has grown. It's not a pretty picture, although the greatest of the materialists would vehemently argue the absurdity of that ironic statement. Yet the painting of such a coarse picture was necessary for the illumination that I hope will come from injecting yet another coarse word into the admixture. That word is psychology. This is a vast subject, and one that has been vastly corrupted within the machinations of both academia and medicine. But suffice it to say that being such a critical aspect of the subject at hand, self-esteem, it must be given its place within our systematic discourse. Due, however, to the limitations of space within the confines of a single book, our interrogation of this massive specialty will therefore be confined, for the most part, to the study of the ego. The ego. or the almost visible you. I say almost visible because the ego, although invisible to the physical senses, can still be indirectly detected in virtually any conversation or interaction between two or more individuals. It comes out in everything we do, making itself known either by insinuation or by direct action, like when a person does something that will benefit them and no one else. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines the ego as one of the three divisions of the psyche in psychoanalytic theory that serves as the organized conscious mediator between the person and reality, especially by functioning both in the perception of and adaptation to reality. But the ego is much more than that, as evidenced by its more common definition, an inflated sense of self-worth. This indicates that there are two aspects or parts of the ego, the first being mental and the second being emotional. The mental ego. The mental ego is the aspect of the ego that is mentioned in the above dictionary entry. It is the part of our mind that we associate with the statement, I am. It creates and perpetuates the conception that each of us is a singular entity, distinctly separate from our environment, as well as from anything else that's within our environment, including each other. For most intents and purposes, this is necessary, as our evolution is benefited by the idea that we can each move forward on our own, and every gain we make as independent entities proves this idea time and time again. On the other hand, evolution is itself a multifaceted process. Gains are not only made on an individual basis, but also on a collective basis. And more importantly, these two processes are advancing in tandem, and different collectives or groups of people are evolving in different ways. A brief look at bipartisan politics should be sufficient to satisfy the burden of proof in that regard, regardless of your vantage point within that burdensome milieu. I've briefly outlined the benefit of the mental ego, so I'll pose a brief question here. Are there any drawbacks to having a mental ego? I'll let the reader chew on that morsel until we readdress it much later. The emotional ego. The emotional ego is the part of our being that we associate with the statement, I want. This aspect of the ego is an altogether more shady character, as the benefits of this side of human nature are not as clearly drawn. This is very interesting in light of the fact that we each possess an emotional ego, and we have each surely worked tireless hours attempting to fulfill that part of our ego in some way or another. Whether in argument about who's right and who's wrong, nobody wants to be wrong, and we all think we're right. So we tend to fight arduously to at least show that we're right. Or in contests of intellect, skill, beauty, etc. Nobody wants to be the loser in such contests either. So we each strive, more or less ardently, to be the winner. But what benefit is winning really? Surely it can be argued that winning a contest which pays out an award, such as money, can be placed, at least tentatively, in the category of benefit. But that benefit is only to the self and always at the loss of one or more others. But most of the contests that we take part in are those everyday, moment-to-moment affairs within which we're endlessly contending about why we're right and why the other person is a complete and total idiot, whether that aspect is said or implied, and all while the other person is either saying or thinking the exact same thing about us. Such scenarios are most certainly not a benefit to anyone, nor should they ever be construed as such. Yet they go on day in and day out in virtually every household, business, and institution worldwide, and the end of such competitive bickering does not appear to be close at hand. It should surprise not a single soul that the driving force behind the emotional ego is emotion itself. And since emotions in general are notorious for supporting selfish behavior, whether it be hatred, greed, jealousy, etc., we should always beware the negative force, or at least potential negative force, of our own emotional ego. Before moving on, I would strongly advise each and every reader to ponder as deeply as possible upon the negative aspects of the emotional ego, regardless of whether you've noticed these aspects in yourself or in others. We all possess this aspect of human nature, so it's no great alarm if we sense these things in ourselves. I myself am nowhere near immunity from such internal forces and have to work daily or even on a moment-to-moment basis at subduing and mitigating the sway of this aspect of myself. I'm quite positive I'm not alone. Wounded pride. We have all been there, and most of us have been there myriad times. It hurts. It stings. It smarts. We each feel the burn in different ways. Some of us feel it in the way we look, others in the way we think and/or act, and still others in the diminished size of their bank account. Pride and the emotional ego walk hand in hand. This applies to both the positive and negative aspects of pride. On the negative side, when our ego is hit, our pride takes the same hit. They could in fact be seen as being one and the same thing, as the correlations are literally 1-to-1. False pride. But when we really look as deeply as we can at the giving and receiving of such emotional wounds, we can begin to see that most of these dynamics surround what we call false pride. False pride, simply stated, is what most pride really is. For instance, a person is sadly mistaken who thinks that their big house, their new car, their stylish clothes, and their impressive bank account prove that they are better than others. And the fact that they think so proves that they are not better because morality requires equality, nobody thinking they're better than anyone else. Highly ironic, but true. This revelation should help in alleviating at least some of the negative pressure that the victims in these types of circumstances have a tendency to feel, therefore assisting with the associated self-esteem. But this book has so much more to offer. An analytical tool. When we revisit the framework outlined in Chapter 1 and overlay our emotional egos onto that framework, the ideological juxtaposition provides us with perhaps the greatest tool for the analysis of modern psychology, dialed in to focus on the ever-growing problem of self-esteem. Chapter 3. A Conspiracy. It may seem funny for some that I would start a chapter with this heading, as most people don't believe in grand conspiracies. But as I have shown in Chapter 1, the methodologies of marketing and PR refined by Edward Bernays in the 1920s were quickly taken up by the entire world of marketing and PR. And those worlds of marketing and PR have been engaged by every large company that has a product to sell, as well as by every large group that has an idea to promote. So if the standard practice of virtually all companies today is to manipulate the minds of everyday people, then it really is a conspiracy, plain and simple. But my motive here is not to indict the operators of these marketing and PR firms, although I do so in my own mind, but rather to elucidate the reader on the second most important point I have to make in this book, that you, as a consumer, have purposely been led by these crafty marketers to a point of low self-esteem. This has been strategically done so that you will then feel the need to purchase their company's products, with the vain hope that the ownership of these products will help raise your self-esteem back up to the normal level. Self-esteem. A healthy level of self-esteem relies on certain factors. One important factor for most people, as nebulous as it is the human desire to be viewed as normal. Of course, the term normal is difficult to define, But the salient point is that nobody wants to be less than the people who are around them. They want to fit in, to be on equal footing, to be in with the crowd, and so on. Otherwise, people have a tendency to feel left out, and this makes them feel dejected. Another factor in the self-esteem equation is the desire for humans to feel distinguished among their peers, or in society in general. And if a person isn't feeling distinguished by any factor that is internal to themselves, beauty, talent, etc., they have a tendency to attempt to distinguish themselves in other ways, usually by purchasing something new or cool. Whether it's clothing or a new car or smartphone, their perception is that their new acquisition improves their appeal. This also makes it easier for them to keep from being judged negatively by others, which is, of course, a critical aspect of self-esteem, no pun intended. The social jury. Humans have a built-in tendency to fear being judged by others, as any negative judgment is registered by the emotional ego as an assault, which creates an emotional wound. This virtual wound reduces the comfort level of the person who was injured, and that person then feels desperate to alleviate the pain. Since these types of judgments are a feature of human society as a whole, the term social jury is an excellent metaphor, recalling scenes of courtroom drama, just like the adjoining metaphor, the court of public opinion. Regardless of the specifics of its local members, the term applies equally to any and every grouping of individuals. This social jury wields immense power due to its ubiquitous force in and across society. Whether it's conscious or unconscious, often a combination of both, groups of people create these dynamics in the way they act, the way they talk, their facial gestures and other body language, etc. Even the tiniest act, such as the briefest condescending look, can send a sensitive person into the deepest despair due to its extreme emotional impact. Again, whether or not this is intended isn't the subject of our current investigation. The matter at hand involves the simple fact that these social forces exist and are in fact extremely common. Public image. This social jury is the primary reason that people desire a strong public image. For without the judgments of others, people wouldn't really care that much about their appearance. But the social jury can be extremely harsh, especially when it comes to total strangers. Humans tend to judge people they don't know even more harshly than they do their family, friends, and associates, evidenced by the fact that people dress up when they go out. This is especially the case when people go out at night or to special events, as the specialness of the occasion provides apparent justification for this. But let's face it, the typical judgments that are handed out on a daily basis by the average person or group, whether they be peers, neighbors, work associates, or total strangers, are extremely petty. For instance, if a homeless person walks into a store in the wealthy part of town, he or she will almost always be treated like a pariah, which treatment provides impetus for that person to vacate the premises as quickly as possible. That poor person's public image and self-esteem are completely demolished on the spot, unless they happen to be fiercely independent in their thinking, leaving absolutely no room for misinterpretation or alternatives. Whatever the actual circumstances, even if less extreme, people are very predictable in this regard. Most will provide either commentary, body language, or overt actions which indicate that they don't approve of whatever it is they are currently witnessing. Their reasoning, whether internalized or externalized, usually both, is almost always an empty justification for their vanity. Yet this simple fact seldom registers to the average person, because looking within and judging oneself is extremely uncommon behavior, and it can be so uncomfortable that the average person has already turned off such behavior very early in life. This means that self-improvement, for them, has been tidily nipped in the bud. The current state of affairs. Since such behavior is so common, it creates a general environment that not only fosters, but actually causes low self-esteem in others, the innocent victims of petty judgments. So common is this type of activity, in fact, that it doesn't even need to happen in every instance for it to have its negative effect. The best example of this fact, as already illustrated before, is the historical separation of the rich and the poor. Those in poverty know for a fact that they will receive insults, bad looks, and other negative treatment if they venture too near their betters, as the British upper class used to call themselves. So the poor usually keep to themselves, or at least keep out of the high-end establishments. In these cases, a rebuke hasn't actually occurred in situ. Social rebukes of this type have already happened so many times in the past that the fear of reproach is now pre-programmed into that subsection of society, causing them to abstain from such behavior for all time, or at least until they get desperate enough to risk it. This is a very twisted example of Pavlovian programming. A less extreme and more modern example would be someone who sees a commercial for the latest smartphone and immediately upgrades their phone because they know that at least one person in their environment will quietly judge them for having an older, substandard model. Again, the judgment itself by society doesn't need to actually happen for the behavior to take effect. That person has been programmed over years of living in this harsh society that to them the outcome is assured if they don't measure up. 1,000,001 examples could be provided and it still wouldn't be all-inclusive. Clothing, cars, housing, hairstyles, school lunches, etc. And the causes are multiplex: vanity, propaganda, classism, groupthink, etc. But the end result is always the same: injured pride, low self-esteem, and general suffering. A disturbing view. This overarching theme is most certainly disturbing. And with this high-level view of modern life now under survey, the relatively astute systems analyst might conclude that the source of the problem is consumerism. And whereas consumerism is certainly a pivotal upstream element, it isn't the true source, because as we ascertained in Chapter 1, consumerism is engendered generally by flamboyance, and flamboyance by resource hunger, and resource hunger by materialism. And yes, every element in the chain is conducive to the negative end result, so we should always be vigilant in weeding out these negative characteristics from ourselves, or at least attempt to subdue them. But the absolutely dedicated analyst will not rest until he or she is sure that the true source of the problem has been discovered, so it can be dealt with properly and directly. So what is the true source of the self-esteem problem, if not consumerism? Is it the flamboyance and the judgments of others? It's a very important factor, but not the source. Is it the resource hunger that causes that flamboyance? Only indirectly. Is it the materialism that is the root of resource hunger? Not exactly. The true source of the self-esteem problem is the emotional ego. Chapter 4. The Source. Yes, the emotional ego is the true source of the self-esteem problem. Everything else is only indirectly related. Want proof? Consider a person with such internal strength that the harsh words and actions of others has absolutely no effect on their emotions. Gandhi comes to mind. If nasty words and actions have no effect, then they cannot be the source of the problem, plain and simple. Of course, all these things that I've talked about are parts of the problem, but at the very center of it all lies the emotional ego. Control. So now that the source of the problem has been revealed, how exactly is it that we can fix this situation? If the emotional ego is the root cause of low self-esteem, what can be done about it? Most people think that we should try to stop the injurious actions of others so the emotional ego is no longer wounded. Certainly, this is a logical assumption, and we should always defend ourselves and others from any external aggression. But this is certainly not the practical answer, because we cannot control the actions of others, nor should we according to moral law. And this is still not going to the source, which is the emotional ego itself. So, with that being said, there are two different methods for affecting the emotional ego, the negative method and the positive method. The positive method is truly wonderful. More on this later. The negative method. The negative method employs the action of negation or suppression. The key is in realizing that negative emotion of any kind interferes with contentment. So it is most certainly in our best interest to control the emotional ego. And we can. We can suppress any activity of the emotional ego just as we suppress anger when it rises. Anger is also part of the emotional ego. This is a great example because we were all taught at an early age to suppress anger in our terrible twos. So most of us are reasonably good at it after so many years of practice. So we can do the exact same thing with the other aspects of the negative emotional ego. Just suppress the negative emotions when they begin to rise, or beforehand if we're wise enough. When I was a young boy in Sunday school, and when I would rather have been home playing, I remember being taught the concept of turning the other cheek. The idea was that when someone speaks against you or slights you in any way, you simply ignore or suppress the negative emotional response that tends to rise on such occasions. Now, in retrospect, I can see that this advice was extremely good. Even though I am no longer a Christian, I still try to keep the good things about Christianity in my life. Just imagine a world completely filled with people who had that level of internal strength. I'm guessing that many of the world's religions teach something similar. It is, after all, a great moral lesson. But, morality aside, it's also quite instructive to consider the purely pragmatic or utilitarian aspects of suppressing the emotional ego. Let us examine these aspects now and their potential results. By suppressing our emotional ego, 1, we would be acting as agents of de-escalation and peace, which would be a benefit not only to ourselves but to society in general. Certainly to those in the general vicinity. 2, we would allow those who seek to wound us the opportunity to learn from their own mistakes. 3, we would not suffer from any slight because there would be no emotional wounds to lick. Emotional wounds only exist when we allow them to. Therefore, we would have the opportunity to be content and possibly even happy during those moments. And 4, we would take an evolutionary step forward, and by doing so, we would be assisting humanity in the slow but necessary evolution of mankind through our own immensely valuable example. Of course, such action takes no small measure of willpower. But the will of one person can be mightier than the physical frame of Hercules, depending upon how it is wielded. This is why some of the greatest allegories in ancient times spoke of the labor of Hercules. And this brings up another very interesting and useful point. Any individual who can muster and master the level of willpower it takes to overcome the emotional ego has reached a level of greatness unattained by the average person. This, in itself, should be sufficient to completely heal the emotional ego and provide a very positive injection of good self-esteem. because it proves you are great. Much more will be added about this method in coming chapters. The positive method. On the flip side, from the negative method, there is the positive method. This method attempts to please the emotional ego and can be absolutely wonderful in its effect. The previous section illustrates the very first aspect of the positive method, seeing your own greatness in the level of willpower that you can wield. But this is only a tiny fraction of the true value of man and woman. Therefore, the other aspects of the positive method are invaluable, capable of taking you 1,000,000 miles further. This is just one of the things we'll address in Part 2. Part 2. The Invisible You. Chapter 5. Spirit. Virtually every religion on earth speaks of the spirit in some form or another. The general consensus might be stated as such. Humans are not just physical creatures, for there is a part of us which is non-physical. This non-physical aspect of us transcends death and goes on to greater and greater things in the afterlife, life after this life. Because this aspect of us is non-physical, it is therefore invisible. This invisible part of us is always with us, usually silently, but sometimes it whispers very quietly to us. Its voice is also non-physical, so we can't hear it with our physical ears. We hear our spirit with our virtual ears as intuition and as our conscience, very gently guiding us through the most important moments of our lives. The spirit can and should be seen as the very highest aspect of ourselves, the part of us that transcends not only death, but also emotion and thought. It is the eternal aspect of who we are, and the only part of us that goes on forever and ever. This also indicates that our spirit is very old, which insinuates that it carries with it perhaps the greatest of all things, wisdom. So then, why are we all not immensely wise? Why do so many of us stumble around as if in the dark, sometimes not even understanding the simplest of things? As I said a moment ago, the voice of the Spirit is so soft that it usually goes completely unnoticed, at least by the majority of people on earth. To hear its voice, a person must first wake up to the fact that their spirit exists, and once they take this all-important first step, they must then begin listening intently, paying close attention to their intuition and their conscience. By maintaining constant vigilance, the communication channels between the body and spirit open, slowly at first, and over time become more and more efficient. So, as ever, with practice, diligence, and patience, through the application of willpower, the voice of the Spirit can finally become clear. The qualities of your spirit. Some of the qualities of your spirit have already been mentioned, but here is a more complete list. 1. Your spirit is invisible. 2. It is eternal. 3. It is the very highest aspect of you as an entity. 4. Your spirit is your guide as you live here on earth and after. 5. Your spirit is the beginning of you. More on this later. 6. Your spirit is the most powerful aspect of you. Its power is awesome and marvelous. 7. It is the only aspect of you that is perfect, without any flaws. 8. Your spirit quietly watches everything you do. 9. It listens to all of your thoughts. 10. Your spirit is the best friend you will ever have. As you can see, your spirit is truly amazing. So, one of the greatest keys in life is this very knowledge, and the use of this knowledge in unlocking at least some of the powers of the spirit, so that we can access those powers. And the power that we most need is that of wisdom, which, fortunately for us, is the first power to be unlocked. Because the spirit is so old, it is therefore extremely wise. Wisdom at that level can be quite stunning. There are many aspects of this great wisdom that we can and should learn from, but the aspect that we'll be focusing on in this work is the wisdom of true self-esteem. Self-esteem at the spiritual level. As has already been said, the spirit is without flaws, so it is perfect. Because of this, it has no need for self-esteem. And if it did, its self-esteem would be perfect, because as a perfect entity, it would esteem itself very well indeed. In fact, that's one of the reasons your spirit made the decision to form your body and emotions in the first place. It wanted to experience the trials of earth and of physical life in general, so that it could prove the wisdom that it already knows. Because proving wisdom is the only way that it will be accepted as perfect wisdom. And just one part of the wisdom that needs to be proven is the part that concerns self-esteem. To illustrate this, let's take a brief detour, then we'll circle back. The furnace of affliction. We first considered the complex social scenario brought out in Chapter 1, with all the dynamic cultural influences creating the endless cycle of false pride and general emotional turmoil. Believe it or not, your spirit has been aware of this problem from the beginning. And in its great wisdom, your spirit knew that you, and all of us, would grow stronger because of that suffering. Suffering seems to be something that humans do best. We absolutely excel at it. Every single day, most people desire something, whether it's a new car, a bigger house, a knockout girlfriend or boyfriend, anything. And since all those things are hard to obtain, people suffer because they have yet to succeed in their acquisition of those things. But this is all fine in the big picture. That's the picture our spirits see every day. This is what they excel at. In the big picture, suffering of this type is allowed because it dramatically increases the probability that people will expend some energy in the effort to get what they want. Life on earth makes us have to get up and work for the fulfillment of our desires. And why? Because working for the things that we want causes us to grow, and in many different ways. You can see this quite plainly in society, and especially in child rearing. Those who had no hardships or discipline while growing up become spoiled. And those spoiled individuals, almost always people who grew up with wealth, are usually less able to deal with hardship later in life. They are also more careless with the feelings of others, so their sense of social responsibility is rather diminished. Tough love. Parents who grew up in normal families with normal hardships are generally aware of these facts and will make efforts to not spoil their children, at least not too much. And since so many parents over the centuries have felt that overwhelming sense of love for their children, which is so natural, society eventually developed a special phrase for the type of love that is considered the wisest in parenting: tough love. So powerful is the idea of tough love that it was later adopted for use within the addiction recovery arena. The general concept of tough love goes like this. If you love someone, you want them to be happy. But happiness is complex because no person can be truly happy unless they are also independent, strong, wise, etc. And since these qualities cannot be obtained by giving a person everything they want in life, many things must be held back, so that the person is forced by circumstance to do at least some amount of work to obtain them. It is the work that is vital, because it is the work that makes a person stronger. Just like the bodybuilder would never be able to build his or her muscles without doing all that heavy lifting, everyday people would never be able to build their metaphorical muscles doing whatever task it is that will get them the object of their desire. Let's take, for example, John, the loving father of his 10-year-old son, Ethan. One day, Ethan asks for a newer and shinier bicycle, even though his current bicycle just needs a new tire. Instead of spoiling the child with a new bike right away, John tells Ethan that if he fixes the tire himself, with his father's help of course, then sells the bike on Craigslist, again with help, then Ethan will be rewarded with a new bike. Ethan is disappointed at first, but after just a couple weeks, he not only has a newer and shinier bike, he also feels proud of his accomplishment of fixing the old one himself and selling it to another kid. Not only that, in the process of selling the bike, Ethan has learned that the family of the kid who bought it was not as well off as Ethan's family, so they were not able to afford a brand new bike. Nevertheless, that kid was so happy with his new used bike that it surprised and elated Ethan in a strange way. That boy might never have been so happy if Ethan hadn't fixed his old bike and put it up for sale. It would still be in his garage gathering dust. And the list of benefits goes on. Ethan now knows how to change a bicycle tire and use basic tools like wrenches. He also understands much better the basics of mechanical action, how pushing the pedal with his feet causes the bike chain to move, which itself causes the rear wheel to turn. In short, the tough love that John employed with his son ended up helping Ethan to grow, to learn, and to develop a greater appreciation of his possessions. It also taught Ethan to be proud of himself for doing something that was difficult, which helped Ethan to develop a healthy level of self-esteem. Chores for cash. The chores for cash idea plays a similar role. Different families have different names for it. The fundamental idea is simple. If you want cash, who doesn't, you'll need to do some of the chores around the house to get it. Examples. Taking out the garbage allows a child to earn $1 a week. Doing the dishes gets that child 50 cents per meal, which adds up to as much as $2.50 per week, with greater amounts for tweens and teenagers, and of course people whose families have more disposable income. A side benefit to this type of program is that it gives a child the opportunity to learn about handling, counting, and using money early in life. This is not only useful on a day-to-day basis, it also helps to learn independence and responsibility. All money handling builds responsibility. The other thing it helps children to learn is healthy self-esteem. By learning and growing at an accelerated pace, children have a chance to gain knowledge and independence, and even that wonderful thing that might be called kid wisdom. When this happens, that child also has a greater opportunity to build a very natural self-esteem at the same time, because these processes are organically and holistically connected together. Your spirit as a foster parent. So now we can circle back to the role of the spirit. In a sense, you can see your own spirit as a father or mother figure. And as such, it uses tough love to help you in the ways that you need the most, even if you don't know that you need it in that particular way. Just like Ethan, who didn't know he needed to learn and grow in the ways that he did during the bicycle episode, we too need similar assistance from a higher source. Ethan's higher source was his father, while your higher source is your spirit. Like a parent, your spirit knows things about you that even you yourself don't know. Repressed memories, if you have any, unused powers, everyone has those, and much more. And it knows all the things that you do know, all the secrets, all the painful memories, all the happy memories. It puts all these things together and whispers things to you in ways it knows will help you. But you have to remember that it takes effort and courage to listen to that inner voice, and it takes even more courage to follow its advice. Your perfect best friend. Not only is it helpful to think of your spirit as a loving parent or foster parent, it also helps to think of that part of yourself as your best friend, the perfect friend. The perfect friend would only tell you what is good for you to hear. The perfect friend would never tell you anything that would hurt you. The perfect friend only wants for your growth, well-being, and happiness. But unlike your earthly parents, you can tell absolutely anything to your perfect best friend. Your deepest secrets will always be safe. Your deepest desires will always be accepted. Your greatest fears will always be hearkened. Your heart and mind are always safe with your perfect best friend. But it's still you. Although your spirit can be thought of in these interesting and useful ways, it's still you. It's the highest part of your being. It's the most perfect part of yourself. It's the most important part of you. It's the part of us that makes every single person absolutely amazing. And here's the most important part of this book, and perhaps the most important thing that you will ever hear in your life. Because the most important part of you is perfect, it means that you can and should have a perfect self-esteem. You should read and reread that statement over and over again and repeat it every single day as your new mantra. There are also many more mantras at the end of this book. Think it to yourself when you're brushing your teeth, gazing happily into the mirror, seeing your reflection as your higher self. Remind yourself silently when you're standing in line at the grocery store. Shout it to yourself joyously when you're driving. This is the beginning of your immortal self-esteem. And this invisible and immortal you is more beautiful and powerful than you are likely aware. Chapter 6. Perfect Freedom. Your spirit, being perfect, is also perfectly free, unlike the lower part of yourself, your body, mind, and emotions. Your spirit is unbound by fear, anger, greed, depression, or any other negative emotion. It is also unbound by the shoddily constructed philosophies of the human mind. This is because your spirit is not really attached to your emotional ego. It is, but it also isn't. In a way, it's like the remote control for your TV. They were built to be together. They are one complete system. They share intimate communication, and the one part of the system controls the other part of the system. They are not connected by any wires, yet they are one. In this metaphor, you are the TV and your spirit is the remote control. The metaphor is not perfect, however, since the body and spirit can share two-way communication, and since you have your own will, while a TV never needs to control itself. But the metaphor is useful nonetheless because it provides a visceral feel for the very approximate relationship between you and your spirit. And although your spirit is unbound by your philosophies, it does have its own highly philosophical side. This is because your spirit's sole purpose is to provide proof of wisdom, The greatest wisdom in the universe, in fact, because our spirits are all intimately connected with the universal mind, aka God, the only keeper of perfect wisdom. And one of the keys to this great wisdom is in helping you to overcome and eventually disconnect from your emotional ego. But because your emotional ego is bound to you during your stay here on Earth, total disconnection is, if not impossible at this juncture, improbable. The real disconnection comes sometime after the death of the physical body. So during our sojourn on Earth, our spirit desires for us to subdue our emotional ego, just as I mentioned in Chapter 4. And if we maintain diligence in this quest, we can, little by little, achieve better and better results. And more importantly, our willpower, hence our personal power, will become stronger and stronger. Baby steps. Just as baby steps are necessary before a child is truly walking and eventually running, so too are they a necessity in our conquest of the emotional ego. The first days are like very rough seas. As the days turn to weeks, the chop begins to die down a bit. After many months, the water is somewhat calm. And after looking back upon many years and perhaps decades of such efforts, we should be able to see the most placid waters, as if we are upon a still lake far away from the noise of civilization. A confusing name considering the contents of Chapter 1. But in reality, that calm is within, not without. The perfectly quelled heart could drift peacefully through a raucous bar fight without so much as a wince, or be screamed at from within a few inches away and feel compassion rather than hatred. And although I, myself, the author of this very book, could not make it through that same bar without a few winces, and my heart would still skip a beat were any screaming to start, I am nonetheless firmly on the path toward perfect peace, and it is my absolute goal and my stalwart vision to be able to fully succeed in such harrowing times, and as my own future unfolds. I too have been taking baby steps, and as I have seen wonderful results already, after quite a bit of trial and error, I know the path to be both true and right. And it only stands to reason, does it not? Great people have been saying this very thing for millennia, just in slightly different ways. And let me know if you think any of the following people had issues with self-esteem. One ought not to return injustice, nor do evil to anybody in the world, no matter what one may have suffered from them. Socrates. If someone slaps you on your right cheek, turn to him the other also. Matthew, the Bible. An eye for an eye will only make the whole world blind. Mahatma Gandhi. Peace begins with a smile. Mother Teresa. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Martin Luther King, Jr. Love your enemies. Do good to them that hate you. Luke the Evangelist. The Bible. Peace comes from within. Do not seek it without. Siddhartha Gautama, aka Buddha. Passivism simply is not a matter of calm looking on. It is work, hard work. Kathy Kollwitz. When you do the right thing, you get the feeling of peace and serenity associated with it. Do it again and again. Roy T. Bennett. Peace cannot be kept by force. It can only be achieved by understanding. Albert Einstein. Chapter 7. Spirit over Matter. Of course, you've heard the phrase mind over matter many, many times in your life. And although it's a highly important axiom, I always like to take it one step further. In an effort to explain why, I will first need to explain the basic structure of what I call the composite being, aka you. Body. Our bodies are the only part of us that is physical, therefore the only part that's visible to physical eyes. This includes our bones, muscles, skin, nervous system, etc. This is us in the physical universe. This is the part of us that contains all the chemicals that interact with our emotional dynamics. Emotions. Our emotions are not really part of our physical bodies at all, although emotional responses can and do become physical when that response, for instance, triggers your body to produce chemicals like adrenaline, serotonin, and histamine, as in the case of fear. In reality, our emotions are an energy field, attached to us invisibly, like in the TV and remote metaphor. And because this energy field tends to stick together as one body of energy, it is also called by some the emotional body. This is the part of us which contains our emotional ego. Mind. Most people think that the mind is located inside our brain, but this is not entirely true. The mind is far too powerful and vast to be a purely physical object, and the physical memory required to store our complete life experiences would be bigger than a house. The mind is yet another energy field, using much higher frequencies than the energy field of our emotional bodies. This energy field is extremely fast and subtle, and is the part of us that contains our mental ego. So our brain should instead be thought of as a transceiver, like a two-way radio. It is the bridge between our mind and our body. Spirit. We have already discussed the spirit at some length, but the summary would be that the spirit is the highest aspect of ourselves, and the only part of us that is eternal. It is our spirit that makes us immortal. The composite being. It is the combination and interoperability of these four parts of us that makes us who we are. Our physical bodies would be in a perpetually vegetative state without the other parts. Our emotions would be a wreck without the spirit, mind, body components, as there would be nothing to provide balance. Our minds wouldn't be able to grow without the existence of the emotion-body segments, and would have no guidance without the spirit. So the composite being is the whole you, all-inclusive. The hierarchy. The composite being should also be thought of as a hierarchy. Within this hierarchy, the body is the lowest part. It constantly receives signals from the emotions and the mind. The body does not receive signals directly from the spirit, as the mind is the mediator between spirit and body. Above the physical body in the hierarchy is the emotional body. It is highly active and fluid, and usually quite volatile in most people. It receives signals from the mind and sends them to the body. The next higher level in the hierarchy is the mind. It usually acts alone, although sometimes it accepts signals from the spirit. This is because the mind of humans is typically quite resistant to the voice of the spirit. Due to our selfish nature, we tend not to like good advice, so most of us snuff it out. The mind sends signals to the emotions and the body and receives signals back from both to be used as feedback. Using knowledge of this hierarchy for self-improvement. The reason all of this is important is because only by knowing ourselves can we hope to master ourselves. Just as a car mechanic will not be able to repair a car or give it a tune-up without knowing the structure of the car, so too will we be in a much better position for effecting our own tune-up by knowing some of the details of our own structure. And now that these details have been provided, or at least roughly outlined, we can begin our self-improvement in earnest. Since the signals between the body and the emotions are all autonomous, we won't go into any detail about that aspect of connectivity. Because of this, all we really need to focus on are the connections between the emotions, the mind, and the spirit. Never forget the hierarchy. It's extremely important to always keep in mind the ranking of these aspects of ourselves, because doing so allows us to maintain constant control over our lives, or at least a more present control. The primary reason for this is that once we understand that the mind is subordinate to the spirit, or should be, and that the emotions are subordinate to the mind, or should be, we can take our self-improvement campaign to a whole new level. We are now, for the first time, able to focus our work at the highest tier, at least the highest tier that we have direct access to right now. In other words, we're now working very close to the master level. Chapter 8. Feedback. Feedback is a very important aspect of any system. A good example is driving. When you're stepping on the gas pedal, the change in momentum that your body feels as the car pushes you forward tells you how you need to adjust the pressure of your foot on the pedal. Too much foot pressure and your body gets pushed into the seat by the momentum shift of the car. Too little pressure and there's not enough momentum shift to get where you want to go. In this case, the shift in momentum provides the feedback. The hierarchical structure of the composite being has similar feedback mechanisms, although they're obviously not mechanical. For instance, a very loud noise nearby will usually make you jump, then be perfectly still for a moment. This is because the noise entering your ears first triggers your brain to send a very strong signal to your emotions and your mind. The strength of the signal causes your emotions to register fear, and the standard emotional response for fear is for the emotions to send signals back to the body so that the body will produce the aforementioned chemical cocktail of adrenaline, serotonin, and histamine. The adrenaline puts your body on high alert, with all your senses amplified and ready to pick up any further information about that loud noise and about what might have caused it. The serotonin shuts down your muscular responses, which is what makes you sit or stand perfectly still for that brief moment. The histamine gives you a feeling of anxiety so that you are stimulated to do one of two things. One, make whatever it is that frightened you stop happening. The histamine makes you want to act against the external force to make it stop, so that your anxiety will then be justified to stop. Or two, run away to a safe distance. If there are no more loud noises for the next several seconds, the mind begins to take control of the situation, sending calming signals to the emotions and the body that will allow those feelings and those chemicals to begin fading away. And the emotions, receiving no further negative signaling from the body's ears, stops sending out any further signals for chemical production and begins heeding the calming signals from the mind. This is the classic fight or flight scenario, and you can see how feedback is critical in allowing the final calming sequence to take place. The emotional body, stimulated by a sudden external event, sent the lower aspects of the composite being into panic mode because of the highly reactionary nature of the emotions, until the mind finally took control and calmed things down. This is the emotional ego acting in a perfectly legitimate way, protecting the body from the potential of physical harm. This is the good aspect of the emotional ego. and one of the only aspects we want to keep. Self-preservation accomplished. But there's a negative side to this reactionary system. Triggering false pride. Similar events take place when the negative aspects of the emotional ego are triggered, such as the triggering of false pride. This is extremely common and occurs in a variety of ways. Let's take, for example, a very direct negative trigger. Fightin' words. Somebody says something highly offensive to you, perhaps to purposefully cause a reaction. Just like in the previous example, your ears are the first to pick up the signal, and that signal is sent by your brain to your emotions and your mind. Only this time, your mind understands that there's no real threat to self-preservation. This is a matter of pride. So the mind does an extremely quick calculation of potential outcomes, based largely on what it already knows about that person, their relationship with you, etc. In other words, if it's your boss saying these things, your mind will not allow your emotional ego to respond with anger. That would lose you your highly valuable job. Your emotional ego is still wounded by the triggering of its false pride, but it takes no action against the perpetrator because the mind, being higher up the chain of command, demands that the emotions calm down, or at the very least remain invisible. But if the perpetrator is someone who has limited or no control over your life, your mind might allow the emotional body to respond with anger, causing a cascade of equally nasty words to fly from your own mouth. Suddenly, you have the distinct possibility of a fight, extremely counterproductive, wasteful of energy, damaging for all concerned, etc. Or a heated argument, also counterproductive. A highly important clue. Wait a minute. You just let your boss off the hook. How did you do that? Answer: you controlled your emotional ego. You used the martial power of the mind to overcome and subdue the unruly passion of the heart. This extremely important clue provides absolute proof that the emotions really are subordinate to the mind. It's only when the mind doesn't choose to take control that the roles are apparently reversed. Of course, the power of emotions are no great secret, so neither is it a great surprise that we often fail to make that pivotal choice. As powerful as the mind is, we often feel that the emotions are of equal or greater power. This is why I'll repeat the critical advice to never forget the hierarchy. It's forgetting, or more usually not knowing, that gets us into trouble. If we all kept that fact firmly in mind during our usually brief run-ins with those shady customers in life, we would be far more empowered to stay calm, cool, and collected. Two other side benefits of controlling the emotional ego are: 1. It sometimes makes the perpetrator look foolish, since he or she was unable to keep a lid on things while you ended up playing it very cool. And 2, the perpetrator might, just might, go home and realize that they were being a big hothead and might, just might, think twice the next time. False pride and false self-esteem. When you really think about it, self-esteem in many people is built from false pride. All the beautiful things a person owns has nothing whatsoever to do with who they are inside. It doesn't matter how shiny someone's car is or how big their house is, if they're a great big jerk. Yet it's the jerks who are the ones that strut around with their bloated egos and their highly inflated self-esteem, challenging everyone around them to all the various measuring contests that such people love to enter into. It's astounding to me that so many ordinary people get pulled into this type of activity, because anytime it happens in my own environment, I'm already armed with the truth. This makes it very easy, or at least easier, to handle such people. And the truth really isn't so difficult to grasp. If that person's car is newer and shinier, then it's newer and shinier. If their house is bigger, then their house is bigger. I don't mind agreeing with them as long as they're telling the truth. And I try my absolute hardest not to let such comments negatively affect my emotional ego, because I know for a fact that these aspects of false pride are not important in the least little bit. But what's funny is the response I get when I do this. It's almost always a moment of silence, followed by a much milder comment from the perpetrator. My ability to stay calm has magically given them the ability to calm down. And inasmuch as it never lasts very long at all, at least it's a step in the right direction for both parties, and for any bystander who happens to be within earshot. Real self-esteem. The reason I can do this is very simple. My self-esteem is real. Not completely, but mostly. What I mean is, I don't base my self-esteem on my property. It's easy when you have very little of it. Or on my looks. Not much there either. I don't base it on my position in society. Very low indeed. Or on anything else that's tangible. My self-esteem is based solely on what I carry with me inside. My heart, the good part of it. My mind, my spirit. These are my real assets. And I esteem these aspects of myself so very highly. This is why I have such an incredibly high self-esteem for such a poor, ugly, plain-clothed thinker. Of course, I'm being facetious with that last comment, but humor can also go a long way in boosting our moment-to-moment morale. And the most important aspect of my self-esteem goes back to the end of Chapter 5, and the perfect self-esteem that we should all have as immortal spiritual beings. Once you begin seeing yourself in this special way, as an entity of light, perfect and immortal at the center of your being, you too can begin the healing process that a genuine spiritual realization automatically brings about. Chapter 9. Wisdom and Knowledge. Just as the composite being has its hierarchy, so too does the spirit, and this brings up the very important distinction between wisdom and knowledge. Knowledge means the structuring of data. Wisdom is much deeper, as it means the structuring of knowledge. That's two different levels of structure in a hierarchy. The highest wisdom implies that the knowledge is structured in the best possible way, to allow the best potential use of that knowledge. But this is complex because knowledge already has structure. So how do we structure a structure? A fine metaphor is found in the area of modular construction, used in electronics, computer programming, building construction, etc. In this method, you have access to multiple modules, each module with its own function, therefore each with its own internal structure. The builder chooses the modules that he or she needs based on his or her design criteria, and combines them together to create a larger, more complex structure. This final structure has all the functionality of each module combined into one singular system. Getting back to the spirit. Because wisdom is the highest aspect of the spirit already representing the highest aspect of ourselves, this means that wisdom is the highest aspect of life itself, and as such, it is what our spirit wants us to learn most of all. On a smaller scale, it also means that wisdom is the most important aspect of self-improvement. Without wisdom, we cannot hope to improve ourselves to the optimum level and at the optimum speed, which are two things we should all be striving for. Of course, the concept of wisdom is highly abstract. So how do we apply it to self-improvement? Philosophy. This is where philosophy comes in. Philosophy basically means the wisdom that you have at any moment in time. I say this because knowledge is a dynamic thing. It changes over time because the world around us is constantly changing, along with our own understanding of our world. And since philosophy is comprised of both knowledge and wisdom, it means that philosophy is itself dynamic. There is normal, everyday wisdom, and there is higher wisdom. When I say normal wisdom, I'm talking about universal stuff like nobody should go around killing people, and patience is a virtue. These are aspects of wisdom that virtually everyone on earth knows simply by being alive for some time or by hearing it repeated often enough. And although there are those rare individuals that do run around killing people, those people represent only 1 in 100,000, approximately, extremely far to the edge of the bell curve. Higher wisdom, on the other hand, is any wisdom associated with the big picture, the spirit, the triumph of good over evil, etc. But inasmuch as these things are true, it is also true that there are many different philosophies in the world. Some might say that there are 7.7 billion philosophies, as of this writing. But this isn't exactly accurate, because we also know that people tend to fall into different camps philosophically, allying themselves with like minds. This grouping of people provides more social harmony and comfort for the individuals within those groups, as well as providing an outlet within which people don't have to feel afraid to offer their point of view, since those around them will tend to have similar points of view, at least in the general sense. This implies that there are perhaps several 100,000 philosophies, each with its own pros and cons. But the only philosophy that is perfect is the philosophy of the spirit. And although earthly philosophies are never perfect, some are certainly better than others, or at least some provide better results that would be in alignment with your particular objectives. The reason for delving into the topics of wisdom and philosophy are very important in relation to the central theme of this book. As we have seen, negative self-esteem is supported by the negative part of the emotional ego. But aside from emotions, negative self-esteem is also supported by false or insubstantial philosophies. To help illustrate this point, let's consider the extreme example of Adolf Hitler, widely considered to be the worst man who ever lived. When you read about Hitler, it's easy to see that he was philosophically driven, and that his philosophy was itself driven by his negative emotions. Hitler's philosophy was based completely on racial hatred, political greed, mistrust of the public, and a terrible thirst for power. This is the perfect example of a false philosophy, and there are a great multitude of such negative philosophies around the world. That's the most extreme example, of course, and in the realm of self-esteem, we're talking about innocent victims of emotional manipulation. A completely different category on the very opposite end of the spectrum. But the important point to be made, which is a delicate one, is that negative self-esteem will never go away without making some adjustments to the false philosophies that support it. Let's briefly examine just a few of the philosophies typically associated with low self-esteem. 1. The person doesn't believe they are good enough. 2. They don't think they measure up. 3. They compare themselves to others when estimating their own worth. 4. They think that material wealth, money, possessions, beauty, etc., is more important than anything else. And 5. They place little to no value on spiritual matters. When you consider this problem at some depth, it becomes apparent that these are all in direct opposition to the philosophies of a person with a healthy and well-balanced self-esteem, with the possible exception of number 5. All of this means, in short, that it's obviously a rare thing to find or to develop the correct philosophies that will allow people in our society to develop a healthy level of self-esteem. It also means that it's equally difficult to find or build the philosophy that will allow the best and most rapid self-development. This is really one of the ultimate challenges in life, and the primary reason why self-development typically goes at a snail's pace. And this is particularly the case for those seeking to develop a more balanced self-esteem. But it doesn't have to be so. And because philosophy is such a crucial piece of the puzzle, we'll be focusing more on the task of philosophy building and modification as we progress further in this book. Independence. To cut to the chase, in a manner of speaking, independence is to me one of the key elements of the ideal philosophy for self-development, which can be used to make rapid gains in the balancing of one's self-esteem. One of the biggest problems with self-esteem is the problem of influence. We are all being negatively influenced every single day, even moment to moment, especially those of us who cling too much to the media, entertainment, news, etc. And for those whose daily work involves close proximity to many people, such as large office environments, the problem is exacerbated even further. Every single day, we're exposed to various elements that, if we internalize them too much, risk our self-esteem. Another day at the office. The prime example would be the braggers. These are the people who cannot go through one day without broadcasting their bloated and usually false self-worth to the entire office. Whether it's, guess who I'm going on a date with, or I demolished Doug in the basketball court on Saturday. You know who I'm talking about. There's one in every office, and I'll give you 3 guesses how Doug is feeling right about now. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. People can go on endlessly about how they just got a new pair of Sea-Doos, or upgraded their stereo system, or how they deserve that promotion more than the others on their team. Then there's those that cast blame, often in endless successions of rants and raves. Whatever the problem, it's always somebody else's fault and never their own. But if they're always blaming others, then they themselves can't possibly be guiltless, at least not for casting blame. The tenor of the media. Then there's the TV. Total fulfillment awaits in the driver's seat of the all-new, insert expensive car brand here. Or, the perpetrators were 2 black males, causing the self-esteem of any local black male to take an instant nosedive. The list of negative influences is nearly infinite, and it's not going away anytime soon. We can turn some of these influences off, like the TV, for instance. But as for the real and present people in our lives, since moral law precludes the idea of controlling others, which is for the most part an impossibility anyway, we are forced to find another way. And this is true for almost all people, since even those who work at home have to go out shopping, run errands, etc. They're still going to be dealing with other people now and then, and should therefore desire to develop themselves in the same way as anyone else. So the challenge, in light of what has just been said about knowledge, wisdom, and philosophy, is this: how can a person develop a philosophy that will allow them to deal with all this noise, all these negative influences, in the best possible way? Thick skin. The only alternative is to control ourselves. It's absolutely no good to absorb all this negativity. In fact, those who do so, or attempt to do so, run the risk of serious emotional damage and possibly even a life-altering event. So the go-to method, really, for dealing with all the insanity, because that really is what it is to develop thick skin. The idea is that you turn down the volume, so to speak, of your own senses. This doesn't mean that you become ignorant, although it's certainly fine to ignore the worst of what's coming in. Commercials about horror films, for example. I do my very best to ignore those, since there's absolutely nothing positive about horror. And when you're trying to concentrate on your professional work, for instance, then a certain level of temporary ignorance is completely justified and usually quite constructive. But in those moments that you're not in deep concentration about something work-related or anything important, rather than ignoring most of what you hear, it's best to watch and/or listen as passively as possible. What do I mean by this? I mean to turn off the emotional core and watch or listen for the sake of information only. Do not internalize what you're receiving, at least not yet. I know this sounds extremely difficult, and of course it is, especially in the beginning. So I'm going to provide you with some more helpful tools in the next chapter. And always keep in mind that anything that we practice often gets easier and easier. Chapter 10. The Philosophical Filter. And now we get to the good stuff. Remember the hierarchy? If you do, you're already halfway there. Since the spirit is at the top, the mind below the spirit, and the emotions below the mind, it's not difficult to see that any filtering mechanism would have to work first at the lowest level, the level of the emotions. Why? Because immediate emotional response is the exact opposite of what we want in life. The worst philosophies in the world, as we saw with Hitler, are those made solely from the emotional standpoint. Those are the philosophies of greed, hatred, lust, racial fervor, religious zealotry, criminality, despotism, etc. Being the lowest member of the chain, the emotional body is entirely inadequate at the task of philosophy building. It will almost always be a failure, no matter what, with very few exceptions, like those extremely rare and wonderful people who have developed perfect hearts. The reason the heart so often fails at philosophy building in the average person is because philosophy requires logic, and logic and emotions are so often at odds. And negative emotions are always at odds with logic. If you simply reflect on that last statement, you'll find yourself in a new position of strength and perfectly equipped to handle the next task. Build your emotional switchboard. The very best thing that any person can do to instantly propel themselves forward at light speed with self-development is to build their emotional switchboard. This is a visualized virtual terminal of sorts inside your imagination, the control board in your mind. In it, there could be many different controls, like a lever that you push upward when you see someone in need. Pushing that lever upward might help you to be more empathetic toward them, which is a favor to all of humanity. That's because empathy is one of the best emotions and proof that the emotional body has an excellent reason for its existence. This is just an example, and there are many possibilities here. But the most important control, and the one that needs to be positioned dead center, is the on-off switch for negative emotions. This is the switch that will change your life. This can be any type of on-off switch, but really the bigger the better, because if it's a nice, big, two-handed sort of thing, this gives you more psychological leverage over your lower self. And although the switch is very large, imagine that it's still very well oiled and extremely easy to flip. It offers no resistance whatsoever to the force of your virtual hands, which you will learn to control it with. What you want to do is to associate this switch with all of your negative emotions in the most direct and complete way that you possibly can. The more real that switch is, and the more deeply it's connected to your emotional ego, the more definite the effect it will have on your emotional state. How to use your new and wonderful switch. When you see or hear something that you think might affect your emotions in a negative way, or you feel your emotions rising, very quickly imagine taking hold of that great big switch in your mind with both of your virtual hands and pulling it swiftly downward to the off position. Imagine that when the switch clicks audibly off with a boomingly loud noise like an impossibly huge switch in a train station, that all of your negative emotions have now been completely deactivated. Imagine that the deactivation is instantaneous, or basically as fast as you can possibly make it happen, and complete. You can feel the tension within you going back down and going away. For some of you, this will work right away, and your life will have changed for the better from that moment on. You are incredibly fortunate to have found this amazing tool for your emotional toolbox. For others, it takes time to get accustomed to this type of thinking. It really depends on the way your particular mind works, as some people have imagination in spades, like artists and musicians, while others have very different skills, sports, communications. But all people possess the faculty of imagination to at least some degree, and it is the existence of that faculty that really matters, not the power of that faculty. It means that this tool can work for literally anyone, given enough practice. And after many months of practice, you will most certainly feel a change in your ability to handle external stimulus, especially those influences that can be problematic for those who do not possess such a wonderful tool. Now that you have the amazing emotional on-off switch in your virtual toolbox, you can begin really filtering those incoming signals from society without the involvement of that pesky emotional ego. This is amazing in itself because it allows you to turn off your emotional ego instantaneously, or at least its major actions, so it won't be so easily triggered or wounded by others. And in so doing, you allow yourself to bring your self-esteem to greater and greater heights. And by filtering information without the use of negative emotion, it allows you to begin building a philosophy that is based on logic and the higher emotions like love, compassion, etc., and on spiritual wisdom, such as the spiritual wisdom that inspired this entire book. Philosophical sorting. The next step after filtering, i.e. removing all the negative emotional garbage from the incoming stream of external stimuli, is sorting. You want to use your new logical faculties to sort incoming data into their appropriate categories: positive, negative, good, bad, materialistic, spiritualistic, etc. We do this based on our own list of criteria, which is, of course, a very personalized list. Hint, The criteria that will help you leap forward in your abolition of the emotional ego and in the pursuit of higher goals are going to be key here. For further clarification, criteria-based sorting is the invisible method that all people use on a daily basis in the building of their philosophies, although most people do it subconsciously. As people walk through their lives, they will either accept or reject the things that they see or hear based on the list of criteria that already exists in their mind. As we have already insinuated, many of those criteria are emotion-based, which muddies the philosophical waters. So by eliminating, or at least reducing, the negative reactions of the emotional ego, the sorting process can become much more clear, and the evolution of our philosophies can become more rapid and productive. I'll explain it more in the next section. This is one of the many benefits of building and possessing that ever-important emotional switchboard. Even though it only exists in the mind's eye, it gives us immense power that we can use for the betterment of our own lives. Eventually, with practice and dedication, we can even hope for a day when we no longer react at all with our emotional egos. That will be a beautiful day indeed. Making a list. For now, it's helpful, very helpful in fact, to get a pen and paper or to create a new Word document and make a list of your own philosophical criteria. Believe it or not, this can really be a catalyzing moment in a person's life because most people never think about their philosophies in such concrete terms. The act of putting them on paper solidifies your ideas and gives them an aspect of physical form. This is helpful in two ways. One, it crystallizes positive criteria so they are more easily acted upon. And two, it allows us to re-evaluate negative criteria more easily. The following is an example of a positive criterion. If it involves helping others, it's a good thing. This is positive because helping others is not only good for those other people, but good for all mankind due to the positive example. Therefore, it's good for us to help others. The crystallization of this positive criterion is helpful because it will allow you to better put that idea into action in your daily life. It's like having a shopping list. You're less likely to forget something you wrote down. The following is an example of a negative or bad criterion. If a person is on the opposite political party from me, anything they say is a bad thing. After writing such a sentence down and rereading it a few days later, it might become clear that this criterion might have been supported by the negative emotional ego, and also that it isn't entirely productive to an elevated thinker. So you might decide to rewrite this particular criterion to something more productive, like, if a person is on the opposite political party from me, their opinion is still valid from the perspective of those in their party, so it is neither good nor bad, just different. You can continue taking personal notes, adding perhaps that every person is equal under God, so I will listen to the opinion of anyone regardless of their stance. I don't have to believe them, I only have to listen. Note, moments like this are the perfect times to use your new emotional switchboard. So, little by little, you can massage your list of criteria, slowly weeding out the items on the list that are connected to the emotional ego. Hint, it would have been good to turn off the emotional switch before creating the list in the first place, thereby decreasing the likelihood of negative emotional thinking. Positive emotions are usually fine as they are one of the driving factors of evolution in the first place. The positive emotion compassion provides the perfect example of this. Compassion is the emotion par excellence. A much better filtering mechanism. Once you're satisfied with your list, you are ready to start the philosophical filtering process anew. Your new list, in combination with your new emotional switchboard, will allow you to take a much more objective stance in society, to watch without overreacting, to listen without responding negatively. And in so doing, you will undoubtedly find that this type of stance is a wonderful new thing. And you will likely start hoping that others will begin doing the same thing. And little by little, your philosophy will expand and improve, and will also solidify because it is being proven by the positive results that are being achieved within your mind and your heart, and in your daily life as well. This is the greatest hope of your spirit, and once you achieve this amazing win, you are considered by your spirit to be in a new category of living. True self-esteem. At this point, we can finally focus on what this book has been slowly leading up to: true self-esteem. We've talked about the bloated and typically false self-worth of those who love to brag, cast blame, etc. We've talked about the low and also false self-worth of those who fall victim to that first group. So what is true self-esteem? True self-esteem is true value. And it is key to remember that all people have true value simply because all people have a perfect immortal spirit. All other factors are additive. If, for instance, you are always doing your best to be a good person, you are of excellent value to society. Therefore, you are even more worthy of true self-esteem. If you can listen calmly to the opinions of others, regardless of whether those opinions align with yours, you are even more worthy of true self-esteem. And if you happen to be that rare person who is willing to go out of his or her way to come to the aid of others, then you are a true gift to humanity and deserve the absolute highest esteem, which should easily translate over to your own self-esteem. And always remember that value isn't only in what we do, it's also in what we are. Spiritual self-esteem. And now we come back to the spiritual aspects of self-esteem, which are really the most important, and luckily the most easily achieved. As we outlined at the end of Chapter 5, and alluded to again a moment ago, because the Spirit is perfect in every way, it is deserving of the highest possible level of self-esteem, even though your wonderful Spirit has no need for such things, being completely detached from your emotional ego. And because your spirit is your higher self, it means that you yourself deserve the same level of self-esteem. You and your spirit are one. It's just that the spirit is unseen, unheard, etc. But it's there all the time, and it's the immortal and perfect you. And since all people fit this category, it means that the self-esteem problem is totally superfluous and really just a huge waste of time and energy, because we're all highly esteemed in the eyes of our Creator. And if you're highly esteemed by the Master of the universe, the highest of all beings, then you certainly don't need to concern yourself with the petty judgments of others. And this is what allows us to circle back around to the extremely important concept of independence. The truly independent mind. With the acceptance and approval of the Creator, which is automatic, unlike what you may have been told over and over in church, your need for the valuation of others should therefore be nullified. And this nullification should be complete and final. And by throwing that virtual switch down on the negative emotional ego whenever trouble rears its ugly head, you actually begin to set out properly on that road toward real independence. Independence comes in different types, so to be clear, the types of independence I'm alluding to are 1. Emotional independence, 2. Philosophical independence, and 3. Spiritual independence. Let's take these aspects one at a time. Emotional independence. This is created by suppressing your emotional ego and effectively removing it from the everyday social equation, particularly the negative aspects of it. By doing so, you become independent of its negative effects. This gives you a sort of insulation from the opinions of others, meaning that you are hence more independent from what they're saying or doing. Their words can no longer have a direct negative effect on you. Philosophical independence. This is created when you remove your negative ego from the philosophical filtering process, which allows you to remove the opinions of others from your own philosophies. Again, because those opinions no longer have a direct negative effect on you. Spiritual independence. This is created simply by realizing that your spirit, your higher self, is perfect, and this fact provides you with the potential of a perfectly balanced self-esteem. And it is the wisdom of the spirit which causes the cascade of positive philosophy, followed by positive action, allowing the total independence, all three aspects, to come to fruition. Notice the hierarchy is still in play here, as it always is. So it's really this trinity of independence that allows the negative emotional ego to become nullified, and the whole ego to become balanced in turn. Rather than relying on material criteria to feel fulfilled, materialism is negative. Your emotional ego can now begin recognizing the all-important spiritual criteria, which are all positive. After some time of living in this way, your emotional ego will transform from a negatively polarized emotional body into a positively polarized emotional body. This new positive polarization of the emotional ego transforms the quality of life of the individual from negative to positive, which is completely revolutionary because negative and positive are polar opposites. This is because rather than walking through life feeling dejected, frustrated, angry, or jealous, whatever negative emotions have been the particular thorn in your side, you can now stroll through life with the confident gait of an independent and free spirit, knowing that because you are at the core a perfect and immortal being, you can never be destroyed, even by that thing we tentatively call death. There is no death, if we're all eternal. That means that death is simply the beginning of another way of life. And if you can never be destroyed, then you truly have nothing at all to fear. And your confidence will be boosted even higher if you are continually unaffected, at least negatively, by the words and actions of others. And if you are generally a positive member of society with your own balanced and thoughtful actions. It means that you are a positive and beautiful force in the universe, and should therefore be esteemed at a level equal to any regal figure on any throne of any country. Your self-image should now be that of an immortal being of pure energy, perfect at the core and ready for that wonderful and mysterious challenge that is the future. Chapter 11. Common Wisdom. There are common tenets in any specialty, and the specialty of self-esteem comes with its own elements of common wisdom. We haven't gone over this material yet because, as I stated throughout this book, my goal was to drive directly to the source of the problem. But since no self-help book would be complete without imparting common wisdom, I'll include these tenets now just in case any reader is unaware of any of these precepts. 1. You should treat yourself with care and self-respect, as this nourishes healthy self-esteem. Don't criticize yourself too harshly, only enough for self-improvement. 2. You should try not to talk to yourself in negative ways, like I'm not good enough or I'll never get this right. 3. You should try to only talk to yourself in positive ways, like at least I know that I'm good enough, even if others don't believe it, or I will get this right if I keep at it. 4. Don't compare yourself with other people. You are an individual. These basic tenets, in combination with the deeper contents of this book, provide a complete and comprehensive regimen that can help absolutely anyone to build the perfect level of self-esteem. Balance is what we should be striving for. Not too little self-esteem, and not too much either. Imbalanced people. The biggest problem in the world is that so many people are imbalanced, and this creates imbalance in society. One of the facets of this imbalance, which is especially important within the context of self-esteem, concerns that category of people who brag, blame, and berate others. It is critically important for each and every sensitive person to realize that those people are acting the way they do because they themselves are out of balance. Otherwise, they would not be acting in those negative ways. The other problem is that they have no idea that they are the ones who are the most imbalanced. And this is the reason they don't change their ways. They constantly expect other people to do all the changing, which is, of course, completely unfair, just like so many of those other things that they do. We should always keep in mind that it's the materialistic paradigm which has created this terrible social imbalance, which is why we need to be consistently aware of the need for reducing our own materialistic tendencies and start moving slowly but firmly away from the materialistic paradigm. And when we continually see that all humans are victims of the materialistic paradigm, including those we previously thought of as our enemies, it gives us more personal power that we can use for the patient tolerance of and even compassion for those equally unfortunate people. It can also be quite instrumental to think of those people as less fortunate than us, because at least we are beginning to see the light, whereas they are still stumbling around in complete spiritual darkness. Misunderstanding sin. One of the things that was constantly hammered into my head as a young boy, being raised as a Christian, was the idea of sin and the surrounding concepts of heaven and hell. Hell is reserved for sinners. I still believe very strongly in the idea of heaven. Please feel free to see my other works on this extremely interesting topic. But now that I'm quite a bit older, I have developed a much more evolved understanding of sin, which I think is quite important considering the terribly negative impact that Catholic theology has had on social psychology over the last 2 millennia. The etymology of the word sin is quite complex, like so much of etymology in general. The oldest known meanings of the word sin can be related to the following ideas. 1. Truth. 2. Certainty. 3. Reality, the quality of something being real. 4. Rectitude. 5. Guilt. 6. Essence. And 7. Absence. As you can see, many of the ideas on that list are opposites, which greatly confuses the situation. But this opposition becomes interesting when you put, through meaningful synthesis, all of the alternative meanings together into one cohesive whole. What you come up with is the much more enlightening and psychologically balanced idea of missing the mark. In this regard, it could easily be said that someone who misses the mark, regardless of the specifics, is failing during that moment. But since life can be seen as a long succession of singular moments, that person can simply try again. Given enough attempts, they will almost always succeed, unless they give up trying, in which case they will certainly never hit their target. This insinuates that hell, quote unquote, does not represent a permanent setting of fire and brimstone like so many people think, but instead represents the state of mind or state of being of a person who has yet to hit the target, to do whatever it is that will make them succeed in their endeavors. An example might be someone who drinks alcohol every single day. Because alcohol is generally bad for the body, emotions, and mind, that person is missing the mark of achieving ideal overall health. Alcohol is seen by the liver as a toxin, and the metabolic byproduct is yet another toxin. And because alcohol also deregulates the emotions, it adversely affects the martial leadership of the mind as well as the guidance of the spirit. That person is certainly not going to hell for all time just because of this. They will, however, suffer while they are doing what they're doing. Physically, emotionally, psychologically, socially, spiritually, etc., which can be seen as a temporary hell, aka purgatory. But if they eventually engage their willpower and overcome the urge to imbibe on a daily basis, their suffering will decrease and their life will become better because they will have finally hit the target. As you can see, this newer idea of sin is not only much more realistic, it also helps us to stay on track, or get back on track, without all that negative and terrifying psychological baggage that comes with those older and now outdated concepts. And more to the point, it allows people to be more lenient with themselves since we all err now and then while we're living in this very trying physical world. Erring is natural and it's common, so we should all give ourselves a break while we continue to strive to hit whatever target is that each of us is aiming for. Of course, this means we should give others a break as well. And the truth of this will be driven home even more profoundly with this next revelation. The true source of negative emotions. Here is an extremely important fact that most people don't know. Your negative emotions are not you. I saved this aspect of psychology and spirituality for the latter part of this book because this idea encroaches upon deeper and more esoteric areas of spirituality, even though much of the content in this book borders on the spiritually esoteric. But the basic idea is that the negative aspects of your emotional ego are supported by an external energy field that is negatively polarized and that is separate from you as an entity. The components of this living negative energy field cling to your emotional body and sort of feed off of the problems in your life. It's this negative energy field that gives people feelings of anger, jealousy, false pride, depression, low self-esteem, etc. And it's this clinging that makes it so difficult for us to get rid of those feelings. Inasmuch as this is a real bummer in the eyes of most people, it's actually wonderful news. I say this because it means that we are far less responsible for our negative emotions than we think. It also means that after we die, we'll all get the chance to expel these negative energies from our lives once and for all, and finally be absolutely free from all the negative feelings and thoughts that conspire to pull us down while we're here on Earth. Another very literal conspiracy, as you can see. And a life without a single shred of negativity is the most blessed life you can imagine. And it will most surely be yours one day in the future. Suppression of external forces. The fact that this negative energy field is external to you as an entity also makes it a little easier to suppress negative emotions and the negative thoughts that are stimulated by them. This is because you can visualize that you're suppressing an external force, not internal. You're visualizing pushing it out with your inner light. This brings us back to visualization, which is one of the most useful tools to the progressive mind in general. Self-improvement is most certainly a progressive process. Visualization is completely open territory, where you can be free to imagine whatever it is that will assist you the most. In the imagination, you are both the creator and the master of your entire virtual kingdom. But imagination does take practice. If you find that the emotional switchboard isn't providing satisfactory results, other potential visualizations might include the following. 1. Holding your negative emotional ego down with your hands, your virtual hands. 2. Stopping the motion of emotion by force of will. If your negative emotions are completely still, it means they are no longer active. 3. Opening your emotional pressure valve, which allows you to let off steam, the steam being a virtual facsimile of your negative emotions. 4. Pushing the negative emotional energy away or outward, using the radiant force of your own inner light. Everyone has inner light. It's your spirit. And 5. Cutting the dark strings that connect your emotional body to the negative energy. This momentarily severs the link with it. You can use a blazing sword, magical scissors, or whatever you can think of. Visualization methods are unlimited in scope and power. You can use any other visualization method you can possibly imagine. The sky's the limit with the wonderful power of imagination. Our imagination is one of the most powerful tools we have access to, so we should all learn to use it often and to use it well. And as you're progressing on the path of self-improvement, it's also highly instrumental to silently ask your spirit for guidance along the way. This is kind of like an alternative to praying, or simply a different way of praying. When people pray, their spirits are always an integral part of their prayers, the spirit being the highest link in the chain of personal spirituality and the very direct link to God. And since your spirit is your own, the highest part of your own self, you don't need to take on a sense of exaggerated reverence with it. Simply speak to it using your inner voice, in a conversational tone, gently, using as little emotion as possible, and tell it your thoughts, intentions, desires, and decisions. Then, simply listen for a response. It's likely that nothing will come at first, but the more you do this, the deeper your communication with your spirit will become, and the more wisdom your spirit will begin to impart to you. And that is the most beautiful thing. A very important secret that I've learned over the years in regard to this type of communication is the idea of using your spirit as the sounding board for your own wisdom. Because of the reticence of the spirit, as well as the difficulty in picking up its communication, it is best for us to present our highest wisdom to our spirit and wait calmly for the confirmation. It can take days or even weeks to get a response. But if you are conscientious with your communication, and if your communication is based on virtuous desires rather than materialistic ones, the Spirit will be much more likely to respond. And if, like most people, you do not have the wonderful gift of clairvoyance, which is quite rare, then like me when I started out, you will need to read the response of the Spirit in the matrix of life itself. What I mean by this is that instead of receiving a direct communication, your spirit will be more likely to send its message through the world around you. If you are watchful, you will begin to see things that, although they seem like coincidence, still seem very strange, because they happened right after communicating with your spirit about that exact same thing. These answers of the Spirit can come in many different forms, such as 1. Something a person around you says or does. 2. Something you see in your environment. 3. Something you read in a book, magazine, online, etc. And 4. A thought which seems random at first, but which you quickly realize is providence. And always remember the idea that too much coincidence isn't coincidence at all. In other words, once these things start happening to you often enough, you'll begin to see very plainly that you are being spoken to by the living universe. These ideas probably sound strange to most people, but I know these things from personal experience. And because of the sheer power that is evident from such events, I now know for a fact that such events can provide anyone with this type of personal evidence of the sheer power of their own higher self. As you can see, all of this would promote a wonderful new self-esteem that is balanced and beautiful, because if the universe is speaking to you through your surroundings, it provides a wonderful kind of visceral proof that you are very special indeed. And this can happen to anyone. You just need to start meeting your spirit halfway. Desire. Desire is really a pivotal subject in this domain because, if you really think about it carefully, it's at the root of almost all emotional suffering. We suffer when we don't get what we desire. Others suffer when someone doesn't let them fulfill their desire. The desires of the wealthy negatively affect the desires of the poor, and vice versa. And the same can be said of any two oppositely poised groups, of which there are many. So in this respect, we should all realize that most of the things that we desire are actually interfering with our peace of mind. It's certainly good to desire truly wonderful things, like world peace or the end of third world hunger. But spending all our time with a desperate desire for money, respect, love, pleasure, fame, material comforts, etc., should be seen as being a negative aspect of our living. And we should not only recognize this, but also learn how to control these appetites through the use of the emotional switchboard, brute suppression, replacement therapy, think of something else, etc. Once we control our appetites for material support of any kind, we immediately take control over our own potential for happiness, the real kind of happiness that's born from wise, independent living. Chapter 12. Once again, independence. With that idea of independence triggered once again, we should always remember that a truly independent person has no need for the approval of others. The more independence you can engender in your own thinking, the more you can drive your self-esteem upward to that optimal, healthy level, so that you can become a perfectly balanced person. And while you're continually striving for independent thinking, Take stock of your own particular issues, your own desires and cravings. Think about whether these issues are material cravings or not. Almost all cravings are. And about how important they are in the big picture. The big picture is purely spiritual and in no way materially oriented. A good exercise in this regard is to hold your desire in one hand, using your imagination, while simultaneously holding one of the holy grails of desire in the other, those truly beautiful desires like stopping racial injustice, class conflict, ecological destruction, etc. Weigh your issue and these other issues using the balance of your own hands, as in the scales of justice, and feel the heft of each one, i.e., the importance. Doing this helps us to get a much better sense of the triviality of our own lower desires, and when we see this more clearly, it assists in eventually helping us to overcome our superfluous cravings through balanced, non-emotional thinking. This is true wisdom, or higher wisdom. And remember, this doesn't have to stop us from getting what we want in life. It simply keeps us from letting those things take us over completely. And with a more balanced state of mind, who knows, we might even render ourselves more likely to get what we want. But more importantly, it helps us to move beyond materialism and into the higher life, within which our old, petty desires are completely replaced by much higher desires, those involved with spirituality, the evolution of mankind, etc. This, in turn, helps us to get what we really wanted more than anything else: happiness. Note-taking. It can be highly instrumental to keep a personal notebook for your self-improvement campaign. With every entry, start with the date and time. Time is optional, but can be very useful later on, especially for those who decide to learn more about, for instance, how astrology affects the emotions. Write down your triumphs and your disappointments, your thoughts and ideas, and any new insights. Write down your dreams as well, if you can remember them, and if they relate to your issues, as this can really help to provide a new angle on understanding. It's especially useful to record your breakthroughs and triumphs, and any positive moment in your life, along with any personal revelations. This helps you to remember the good things and to focus on the positive. Invisibility. Something that most people simply don't know, but that I keep in mind every single day of my life is this: others cannot see the invisible and immortal you. And because they can't see that aspect of you, they don't know that it's there. It's right there in front of them, but the invisibility of the Spirit keeps it perfectly hidden. It's this invisibility of the Spirit that causes people to undervalue others so readily. But just because something is invisible, it doesn't mean it has decreased power or value. Take radio waves, for instance. Radio waves surround us almost every moment of our lives. We can't see them, we can't feel them, but turn on a radio and they become immediately apparent. And the electromagnetic waves that make Wi-Fi internet possible are exactly the same, only slightly higher in frequency. And we all know the immense power of the internet and how it has changed our lives irrevocably. The answer to almost any question right in the palm of your hands. So I urge you very strongly to never forget the amazing power that invisible things can have. And more to the point, to never forget the absolute magnificence of your invisible and immortal spirit, and your radiant soul that surrounds your spirit, also invisible, yet immensely powerful. By constantly remembering it, along with its amazing qualities, refer to Chapter 5 often, you will be forever empowered by this crucial knowledge not just because it's important in the greater scheme of things, but also because it helps you to feel that important and shining aspect of yourself, a feeling which fuels your own inner growth and self-knowledge. This is why self-knowledge was so critical in the philosophies of ancient Greece. It has been said 1,000 times that the ancient temple of Delphi contained a single inscription in the proneos: Temet nosce, know thyself. And now the reason for this enigmatic statement is finally made crystal clear. By knowing the infinite value of your eternal spirit, you know that you are both beautiful and unstoppable. Your perfectly balanced self-esteem is now virtually assured. You are now an evolutionary being. Self-improvement, or improvement of any kind, is an evolutionary process. This is because all improvement occurs little by little. And since self-help is obviously your goal, you would not have chosen this book otherwise. It means that you are an evolutionary being. This sets you apart from the crowd, since most people are materialists, which is involutionary instead of evolutionary. The opposite. And because you're an evolutionary being, your upward mobility is virtually guaranteed since you are also immortal. The two combine to create what some people have termed eternal progression, which is something I am a very firm believer in. And although that upward mobility is typically slow, it can be greatly quickened by sheer tenacity and willpower. And even for those who are somewhat less stout at heart, you can still let this new reality feed your confidence and create within you, at the very least, a sort of eternal optimism about life, which is one of the very best personality traits a person can possibly have. That's the most wonderful thing about self-improvement. Eventually, it will take you past all your problems, leading you to that long-sought destination you've heard of and will one day experience: a state of grace. The following statements are provided in a one-by-one format for easy reference. You can use them one at a time or in any combination. Refer to them often. You are perfect at the core. Therefore, you should adjust your self-esteem to match. Everything that has happened in your life is for your own growth and edification. Everything has its place and its purpose. Your purpose is to seek out the greatest wisdom, then to provide proof of it by living it. You are already an immortal. You just need to remember it. One day you will have access to all your powers, and you will shine even more brilliantly than the sun. Everything that you have learned in your life will help you to become a super being. Everything in life is precious, including what you previously thought of as negative or mundane. Therefore, you must learn to love all things, including your enemies. For they exist to make you stronger. You are the creator of your own life. You are the writer of your own story. When you turn off your negative emotional ego, you become a new person. One of the first in what is to become a long line of spiritual revolutionaries. When you become a pioneer, you will be one of the first to arrive in paradise. When you turn off your mental ego, you will become one with the universe. You are immortal, therefore you will never die. You are a god in the making. One day the universe will be yours to command. The present is our greatest gift, as it allows us to create the future as we see fit. That's why it is so aptly named, the present. Thank you for listening. This is the end of Immortal Self-Esteem.